All righty. So thank you all for joining again. You're a very loyal bunch. And this one, I think will take slightly longer. We'll still be within our time frame, but I've got a lot to cover on today's session. So I've timed it, so we should be all right. But we'll obviously have our question session afterwards as well. So I'm very much looking forward to this and to hear your questions. So this last lecture then is focusing on Shakespeare, another of Shakespeare's problem plays, The Merchant of Venice. Don't worry if you don't know the play beforehand. I will be giving you a sort of précis in advance, so you can sort of keep up sides with it. So I'll just share my screen. 1 second, and here we go. All righty, all shared. There we go. All right, so through the magic of technology, hopefully this will all be okay. So there we go. So today's lecture is Hath Not a Jew Eyes? Religious Intolerance and Human Dignity in The Merchant of Venice. So when Tom first suggested to me the idea of giving a series of talks under the umbrella title God and the Bard, I was very drawn to the idea, but I must also admit to feeling somewhat trepidatious, not only because I have no experience of delivering lectures in this manner, but also because the mention of God and Shakespeare in the same sentence invariably points one's academic compass towards that most controversial of plays, The Merchant of Venice. This play tackles head-on possibly the hottest of all hot potatoes, the troubled relationship between Jews and Christians. As you can imagine, this play has had a long and complex performance history, especially in light of 20th century European events. But I believe that it is precisely because the play is uncomfortable and thorny that we should study it, watch it, and discuss it. But first, some context, and we're going to need to go right back to 63 BC for that. So the great Roman general Pompey conquered Jerusalem in 63 BC, and here's some rather lovely artwork on the subject, ending Jewish independence and making Judea a client state of Rome. While Jews did retain their religious freedoms, they were subject to Roman political control and taxation. 30 years later, under Herod, he of the slaughter of the Holy Innocents fame, there was heavier taxation and increasing suppression of dissent, despite his attempt to curry Jewish favour by refurbishing the Second Temple. But as Rome tightened its grip on its client states, Judea became a full Roman province with direct rule being imposed. But this did create problems as Roman leaders, including one Pontius Pilate, often clashed with Jewish customs. We can all recall Jesus and Pontius Pilate's dialogue and the clash in approaches that the two men had. Around this time, messianic expectations and resistance movements grew, and one of those movements became Christianity. About 30 years after Jesus' death, the Roman general Titus swept in. He destroyed the Second Temple and devastated Jerusalem with the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives and many more exiled or enslaved. Another uprising in 132 AD was crushed by the Emperor Hadrian, with further massacres, enslavement, and the depopulation of Judea. Jews were banned from Jerusalem. Judea was renamed Palestina to erase any trace of Jewish culture. Many of the dispersed migrated to Babylon, Egypt, North Africa, and Rome itself. Here you can see a map of the various places that they went. In Rome, they were a tolerated but marginalized religious group under imperial law, always living in fear of tightening restrictions on their civil and religious liberties. But even before the establishment of Christianity as the religion of the empire, early Christian figures were key in shaping the new religion's attitude to its predecessor. Justin Martyr argued around 150 AD that Christianity was the true continuation of Hebrew scripture, that the Jewish people were wrong to misinterpret scripture and to reject the Messiah that Christians accepted in Jesus. Justin Martyr blamed Jews collectively for the betrayal of Jesus and his crucifixion, of course conveniently forgetting it was the Romans who tried and executed him. And he described the destruction of the temple as divine punishment for Jewish unbelief. Of course, the perception of Jews as traitorous and deceptive was easily fostered and fomented, partly because Jesus was betrayed to his death by a fellow Jew whose name is still a byword for treachery today. This thread was picked up and run with by later church fathers in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, including Tertullian, St. Augustine, and John Chrysostom, who even went so far as to say that synagogues were brothels and dens of beasts. Once the Roman Empire adopted Christianity in 313 AD, persecution began in earnest. Legal restrictions were placed on Jews. They were banned from public office, forbidden to build new synagogues, and barred from testifying against Christians in court. And that last one is significant for this play. This was the beginnings of the institutionalization of anti-Jewish sentiment in Christian Europe, and it only really began to be dismantled in the last few centuries, with one major, tragic 20th century exception. It is against this backdrop of discrimination and suspicion that Shakespeare was writing in the late 1500s. Yet another of his plays with an explicitly Italian setting, The Merchant of Venice transports us to one of the richest cities in Europe at the time. Venice was famous as an important Mediterranean trading centre for goods from the Far East. Silks, spices, jewels, and other expensive items were bought and sold there. And of course, slaves were bought and sold too. Venice had the reputation of being full of fashion, culture, and sophistication. I think that's a perception that many of us would agree still exists. And it would have been considered a highly exotic location for an Elizabethan audience. Shakespeare was also writing at a time when England was transitioning from a feudal agrarian society to a market-based economy. And this shift brought new fears. Usury, the charging of interest on loans, was long condemned by the church, but it was becoming increasingly common, especially in urban centres like Venice and London. However much their religion damned it, though, the Christian Venetians were business savvy enough to know that the whole glamorous circus depended upon the ability to lend money at interest, so they held their noses and tolerated it. But in order to try and limit the Jews' power for this necessary evil, who were of course forbidden from working in almost any other profession besides money lending, the Christian leaders created the first ghettos, forcing the Jews to live in a particular area. I must apologize because I'm about to be that person who shares their holiday photos, and we all know how ghastly those people are. But these are pictures here that I took on my last trip to Italy in 2022. So on the right hand, you can see the bridge to the new ghetto, Ghetto Novo. On the top left, the bridge to the old ghetto, Ghetto Vecchio. And on the bottom left, what the main town square in the old ghetto actually looks like now. Those buildings are still lived in today. There's a Jewish population there still, but only a handful of people. It's about between 20 and 30 people who still live there. Very, very few, though. The names Old Ghetto and New Ghetto were actually misnomers because the New Ghetto was actually older in terms of Jewish residents. They were actually named that due to the age of the artillery foundries that were constructed nearby. The ghettos were connected to the rest of the city by these two bridges, and they were only open during the day. At night, they were locked and guarded by Christian guards that the Jewish residents had to pay for. Strict punishments were enacted for any Jew found outside the ghetto at night. Any areas of the ghetto that were open to the canals were bricked up. Outward-facing quays were blocked off to prevent unauthorized entry or exit. Just to give you an idea, in around 1600, about 4,000 Jews were crammed into that area size of about 1.25 acres, which is an area smaller than either an American or a British football field. At the time Shakespeare was writing this play in 1596, Jews had been officially banned from England for over 300 years. Edward I, seen here, also known as Edward Longshanks and the Hammer of the Scots. I don't know if anyone's watched Braveheart here. He was the king of that film's fame. He was the one who expelled all the Jews from England in 1290. And this would not be overturned until Oliver Cromwell changed the law in 1657. Any Jews in 16th century England would have practiced their religion secretly and either converted to Christianity or pretended to have done so. So Shakespeare's audience would not have known any Jews directly. Elizabethan ideas of Jewish identity were constructed through myth, rumour, and stereotype, never through any actual contact with Jews. So far, so prejudicial. But Shakespeare's sole Jewish protagonist, or antagonist, depending on your perspective, is one of the greatest of all of Shakespeare's roles. Any actor would love to play the role. And certainly it's been one of the most contentious roles, the character of Shylock, and he will be our focus today. So I did a quick Google images search, and I just took a screenshot and I posted it on here. You see quite a few different images here of the character, and some of them are quite telling. I'm sure you can see several images of Al Pacino's performance. By the way, if you have Amazon Prime, the 2004 film where Al Pacino plays Shylock, I thoroughly recommend it. It was filmed on location in Venice, period appropriate clothing. Jeremy Irons is in it as well. Joseph Fiennes is in it. It is such a brilliant production. So I do urge you, it's so beautiful looking. So I do urge you to watch it if you want to be a really good student and get that diploma. So we can see some images that are very sympathetic. You see the red cap. That was the garment that Jews had to wear when they were out and about in Venice, outside the ghetto. So it was to identify them. We hadn't come up with the idea of the yellow star yet to identify them out and about in public. So some of these images look rather sympathetic, but there are some images that perhaps don't look out of place in Nazi era Jewish propaganda. Top left, second image in, is a good example there. You can see with the hook nose and the rather menacing, furrowed expression there. So I just want to give you a little bit of background on the performance history of this play, because I think it's actually very interesting. So in the first century after, so Shakespeare's writing about 1596-ish. So in the first century after the play, performances of this character leaned into Shylock as a villainous clown. He was played in exaggerated costumes and often red wigs, which we think is probably a nod to medieval artistic depictions of Judas Iscariot having red hair, probably to mark him out as the traitorous disciple, despite the fact there's no mention of his hair color in the Bible. The contemporary Christian audiences, the first 100 years of this play's history, would have enjoyed the verbal insults and cruel jokes against Shylock. As to them, he is a representative of Christ killers, moneylenders, and all things evil. Remember, this play was designated a comedy in the first folio. The problem play designation, which I mentioned in our last lecture, only came much later. But there was a change from about the mid-18th century onwards, and the role started to be performed with more depth and dignity. So here's a beautiful painting of Charles Macklin. He gave a very sympathetic portrayal of the role at Covent Garden in London in 1741. In deference to my largely American cousins listening, I had a delve into the American performance history of this play, and it's got quite a good one. So Edwin Booth, the brother of John Wilkes, by the way, performed the role, here he is, in the 1800s. And he performed it with a great deal of passionate rage. We're moving away from the villainy and the clownish absurdity into a real sort of heartfelt, angry performance. And then by the time we get sort of up to the end of the 1800s, turn of the century New York, Yiddish language productions of the play were incredibly popular among the Jewish immigrant audiences, who of course were all coming in to Ellis Island, and many of them of course settling in the New York region. We've got this magnificent photo. I was delighted to find this picture. Isn't this marvelous? So on the left there, you can see the Jewish actor Jacob Adler. He performed the role Shylock in both English language and Yiddish language productions, and you can see him gesticulating angrily there on the left. And his approach was very much to emphasize the dignified, tortured patriarch rather than any kind of clownish villainy. So his performances were very, very well attended and very, very popular indeed. But come the late 1930s and 40s, the play was regrettably, but entirely unsurprisingly, heavily exploited by the Nazis. The play was performed on German radio throughout the war, most notably just before Kristallnacht, when Jewish-owned businesses and homes across Germany were vandalized and destroyed on the night of the 9th of November, 1938. There's a picture of Kristallnacht, the aftermath. There was one notable production of this play in Vienna in 1943, and here's one of the few photos of this production. And this production was commissioned to celebrate the city being purged of all its Jews, and Shylock was presented as a grotesque, inhuman figure, and the audience were even encouraged to heckle, curse and boo the character, like we were at some kind of pantomime. So there's Werner Krauss on the right, one of Goebbels and Hitler's favorite German stage actors, in one of the very few photos that remains of that production. But post-Holocaust, productions became a lot more circumspect, moving away from comic villainy or simplistic tragedy towards nuanced, politically and ethically charged readings of the character and play as a whole. While the question of whether or not the play is anti-Semitic is one that continues to rumble on through scholarly and theatrical circles, it is undeniable that many great Jewish actors are not only not put off the role, but have in fact actively clamored to play it. And I found some terrific pictures here. So we can see Dustin Hoffman there in 1986. I think that was a Broadway production. David Suchet in 78. Anthony Sher on the bottom middle there in 84. Zero Mostel, 1973 in the bottom left. Henry Goodman, top middle in 99. And F. Murray Abram in 2011, to name but a few. If you come across that name but don't know where you've seen him before, if any of you ever seen the film Amadeus, F. Murray Abram was the man who played Salieri. So there he is in the top left, because his family is of Syrian Jewish extraction. So part of the reason that this role of Shakespeare's is so compelling is because our author does not write a simplistic, two-dimensional anti-Jewish caricature, but a fully rounded tragic figure who is deeply pained by the loss of his wife. He is a widower. He also has one child, a daughter, and she has eloped with a Christian. And of course, that is a catastrophe in a religion that is matrilineal. You know, you're only a Jew if your mother is a Jew. So of course, Jessica's elopement is a terrible, terrible blow for the community and for him and his family. And he has also, of course, struggled under the constant mistreatment from the Christians that surround him and outnumber him. So with all this background now in place, don't worry, there won't be a test. We can now turn our attention to Shylock's situation within the play.
He also lost his servant, Bassanio.
But we don't care about his servant. So the premise of the play is thus. Shylock is a Jewish Venetian moneylender who has been asked to lend a considerable sum of money to Antonio, a Christian merchant, under a bond with a rather unusual condition: that if the debt is not repaid on time, then Shylock is permitted to claim a pound of Antonio's flesh instead. The 3,000 ducats borrowed, I'll let you know how much that's worth later, are then gifted to Antonio's good friend Bassanio so that he can go off and woo the lady Portia, a beautiful young woman with a sizable inheritance of her own, who will erase Bassanio's financial woes forever if he can only convince her that he's rich and then secure her. Ladies, definitely don't marry this guy. If you've ever seen Aladdin, it's a similar sort of idea. You know, the sort of street scoundrel who has to convince the rich woman that he's like her. So in the scene where the bond is arranged, in Act 1, Scene 3, Shakespeare wastes no time in highlighting the many and varied ways that Antonio has disrespected Shylock in the past. So I'm going to read you the speech. Tom's told me I do all right with my renditions here, so maybe I might get a diploma for this. You never know. Let's have a look. So this is the speech that Shylock, when he's told by Antonio that he needs money, this is what he says in reply. Signor Antonio, many a time and oft in the Rialto you have rated me about my moneys and my usances. Still have I borne it with a patient shrug, for sufferance is the badge of all our tribe. You call me misbeliever, cutthroat dog, and spit upon my Jewish gabardine, and all for use of that which is mine own. Well then, it now appears you need my help. Go to then, you come to me, and you say, Shylock, we would have moneys. You say so. You that did void your room upon my beard and foot me as you spurn a stranger cur over your threshold. Money's your suit. What should I say to you? Should I not say, hath a dog money? Is it possible a cur can lend 3,000 ducats? Or shall I bend low and in a bondman's key, with bated breath and whispering humbleness, say this? Fair sir, you spit on me on Wednesday last, you spurned me such a day, another time you called me dog, and for these courtesies I'll lend you thus much moneys? Great speech, great speech. It is very hard to disagree with Shylock's assessment of the situation. Why should he lend money to a man who has rated, bullied him so relentlessly simply because he is successfully practicing the only professions Christians permitted Jews at the time? Shylock is quick to point out the many ways that Antonio has disrespected him, calling him names, describing him as an animal. This dehumanizing language makes it easy for Antonio to other Shylock, to reduce him to a mongrel who skulks about and deserves to be kicked. Shylock then becomes a scapegoat for his whole culture, being blamed for doing what Christian society silently requires. His tonal shift halfway through it, well then, it now appears you need my help, is a moment for Shylock to reclaim moral power, because a man who has been degraded now has some leverage. His additional exclamation, go to, is the Elizabethan way of telling people to go forth and multiply. There is definitely an irony in the situation that is not lost on either man. I think that if any of us found ourselves face to face with the workplace bully who finally begged for our help with operating the office photocopier, we would need to be made of strong stuff indeed not to rub it in just a little. The treatment Antonio has meted out to Shylock is not just verbal, but veers into physical assault. Not only has he voided his room, spat upon Shylock's beard, but he has been shoved as you spurn a stranger cur, a dog, over your threshold. He is the animal at the gate, an unclean outsider, and Antonio behaves as if it is righteous to reject him. Taking the power back verbally, Shylock turns the tables on Antonio, sarcastically inquiring, is it possible for a cur to lend 3,000 ducats? In other words, if I am a dog you hate, why do you need my help? But of course, Antonio's insults have backfired. If the dog can lend money, then perhaps he's not a dog after all, and the Christian is morally compromised. His description of bending low and using a slavish voice is a vivid parody of expected Jewish subservience, whispering, bowing, and servile. Shylock subverts the expectation that Jews must grovel to be tolerated. His voice here is defiant and unapologetic. This moment exposes how the dominant culture often expects minorities to abase themselves and call it virtue. Similar behavior was expected of slaves in American and Caribbean plantations, where they were expected to bow, doff their hats, and avert their eyes when addressing their white overlords. In apartheid-era South Africa, black South Africans were legally obligated to address white people with titles such as boss and to step out of the way and onto the road to let a white person pass on the pavement. In India's rigid caste system, the Dalits, or untouchables, had to prostrate themselves when speaking with upper caste individuals. And in some areas, Dalits even had to drag a broom behind them to erase their footprints in the dirt. In this moment in the play, Shylock is not only a representative of his tribe, but of all those who have been oppressed, crushed, and vilified. For Christians, this scene raises some profoundly uncomfortable questions. What happens to faith when it slams up against the realities of life? Is religion something that just occurs on Sundays but is optional the rest of the week? We can spit at someone on Wednesday and ask for their help on Thursday? It's clear Antonio does not live out the mercy that his religion professes, and therefore, of course, Shakespeare bitingly inquires this of his Christian audience too. Antonio and Shylock agree to this bond for a pound of flesh, and Antonio gets his 3,000 ducats. But what does 3,000 ducats mean? I mean, 3,000 of anything sounds like a lot, right? How much are these worth anyway? So they were an internationally accepted currency, widely used in trade across Europe, the colonies and the Ottoman Empire from the 1200s to the early 20th century. So this currency lasted about 800 years. So it did pretty well for itself. And here's a very beautiful close-up image of a ducat here as well. The reason why the ducat lasted so long is because these coins maintained their gold weight. So they remained valuable across time. It's very, very hard to equate currency values over time and countries, but let's go based on the gold weight of the coins. A ducat's weight is about 3.42 grams of gold. So times that by 3,000, we get about 10.26 kilos of gold. What's that, about 22 pounds for my American cousins? Assuming 99% purity, The most recent price of gold is about £80,000 or $109,000 per kilo. So we have a grand total borrowed of about £829,000 or $1.1 million borrowed. And again, just to remind you, this money is to impress a girl who is already rich, just so she doesn't think that you're a bum. So obviously, for the sake of the plot, all of Antonio's merchant vessels are wrecked. He's now bankrupted and he's unable to repay his loans, and Shylock will finally be able to call in the bond and claim the pound of flesh. His gleeful anger at this is also compounded by his grief at learning of his daughter Jessica's elopement and her theft of his jewels and money to fund that elopement. Shylock's grief and cruelty at still demanding the pound of flesh, even though Antonio is bankrupt, is met with mockery from two acquaintances of Antonio's. They ask him, "What use is Antonio's flesh?" And Shylock's reply is one of the most startling speeches in all of Shakespeare. "To bait fish withal. If it will feed nothing else, it will feed my revenge. He hath disgraced me and hindered me 500,000, laughed at my losses, mocked at my gains, scorned my nation, thwarted my bargains, cooled my friends, heated mine enemies. And what's his reason? I am a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions? Fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? If we are like you in the rest, we will resemble you in that. If a Jew wrong a Christian, what is his humility? Revenge. If a Christian wrong a Jew, what should his sufferance be? By Christian example. Why revenge? The villainy you teach me, I will execute, and it shall go hard, but I will better the instruction. You can feel the rage in the writing. It's so good. I don't do it half the justice Al Pacino does. I really don't. But it's such an incredible speech. And he wastes no time at all with this. He goes straight in there. His flippant remark about the flesh being useful for baiting fish is a warning shot. A reminder, this is a man who, for all his victimhood, is also motivated by cruelty and revenge. He speaks in the language of commerce. He hath hindered me 500,000. There is a reminder here of Job 19. He hath stripped me of my glory and taken the crown from my head. While his mercantile focus here may seem petty, money is not just wealth to Shylock. It is security and status in a place where almost everyone and everything is against him. His personal ledger of grievances is powerful in its simplicity. There is a magnificent example here of rhetorical accumulation. Each grievance gathers moral momentum from the last, exploring the transition from mockery to marginalization to full-blown persecution. His reference to how Antonio has scorned his nation stands out. This is no longer personal. This is communal. His exploration of what the reason is, I am a Jew, is devastatingly simple. In this instance, being Jewish in itself is a cause for exclusion and contempt by Christians. His powerful rhetorical question, hath not a Jew eyes, the most famous line in the speech, reclaims the common humanity between Jews and Christians. It demands that the audience look at the Jew and really see themselves. It's a cry for recognition, to be seen as made in the image of God, as described in the first book of Genesis. His embodiment of the humanity of Jews continues in his listing of the body parts we all share: hands, organs, dimensions, etc. Even the hardened anti-Semite would find this very difficult to deny. And of course, for Christians to deny that Jews have these qualities too would be to deny the very incarnation, that God took on flesh and became man. And that, of course, would be blasphemous. The two Christian characters listening to this speech, and of course, us, the audience, would probably be feeling most uncomfortable at this juncture, as Shylock so deftly exposes Christian hypocrisy and prejudice. While humans have consistently tried to portray minorities as physically deficient somehow, Shylock refuses such dehumanization. We're all aware of the segregation era belief that blacks had different diseases from whites, and that's why they couldn't share drinking fountains. This stuff repeats throughout history. Shylock continues to catalogue the similarities and focuses now on the vulnerabilities experienced by all. Hunger, illness, injury, laughter, pain, and suffering are universal constants. We are all God's creatures, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer that God has created. So why the prejudice? Shylock's relentless rhetorical questions continue to hammer continue to hammer the Christians to whom he is speaking. And the irony is clear. Christians believe in a Jewish man who bled and died for them, but they deny the humanity of the Jew standing right in front of them. His magnetic final line in this section, "And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge?" takes us back immediately to Old Testament teaching. He's not interested in turning the other cheek. He's going old school, eye for an eye. He then deliberately provokes his Christian audience by asking them what they would do if a Jew wronged them. This provocative question would immediately trigger violent agreement that the Christian would be entitled to take revenge. The word humility here is ironic. It means response or penance, but Shylock is suggesting that too many Christians are unlike their Christ, as they do not forgive, but seek vengeance instead. The climax to this incredible speech is a sinister reminder that if Jews are so bloodthirsty and cruel, then it is because you Christians have taught us well. Anyone who may be familiar with the story of Frankenstein will recall that the scientist's creation becomes monstrous because he is ill-treated and misused to the point of madness. So he decides to become the brute everyone believes him to be because he is exhausted trying to change hearts and minds. In case you're wondering whether Shylock does get his pound of flesh, the play climaxes in the infamous trial scene where the Duke and all the potentates of Venice meet and they try desperately to find a way out of the bond, but Shylock is adamant about its collection. "I stand for law," he shouts defiantly. As things become more desperate, he's even offered 6,000 ducats, $2.2 million, who did manage to, from Bassanio, who did manage to bag the rich wife, by the way. But Shylock's response is so coloured by his rage and thirst for revenge that he states, if every ducat in 6,000 were in 6 parts and every part a ducat, I would not draw them. I would have my bond. He is not interested in mercy. He is not interested in any form of compassion. He prepares to cut the flesh, but he is interrupted because there's a technicality in the wording of it. This bond doth give thee here no jot of blood. The words expressly are a pound of flesh. So take then thy bond, take thou thy pound of flesh, but in the cutting it, if thou dost shed one drop of Christian blood, thy lands and goods are by the laws of Venice confiscate unto the state of Venice. Of course, this has now put Shylock in an impossible situation. He goes to storm out of the court. He realizes he has to back down, but he is detained. "Tarry, Jew, the law hath yet another hold on you. It is enacted in the laws of Venice that if it be proved against an alien, that by direct or indirect attempt he seek the life of any citizen, the party against the which he doth contrive shall seize 1/2 his goods. The other half comes to the privy coffer of the state, and the offender's life lies in the mercy of the Duke only, against all other voice. In which predicament I say thou standst." Shylock is now obliged to beg for the mercy he so recently scorned, and he sinks to his knees in front of the court. Antonio finally chooses mercy and gives him back some of his money, but this mercy is conditional upon Shylock converting to Christianity. If he doesn't take it, then the mercy will be withdrawn. This, of course, is the ultimate hammer blow that could be inflicted, and Shylock has no choice but to accept it. He slinks away from court, a broken man, cast out from his tribe, but not fully accepted by his new one either. While Elizabethan audiences would have viewed this conversion as an act of kindness, saving a soul for Jesus, modern audiences are far less likely to view this compelled conversion as such. Now, many of you might be sitting there thinking, okay, she's given Christianity a good bashing here, but that's not relevant anymore because we're so much nicer than 400 years ago. And yes, that's true up to a point. Christians no longer burn other Christians at the stake for believing in the wrong flavour of Christianity. Interfaith dialogue has never been stronger. Anti-discrimination laws exist in most liberal democracies. But here's the rub. Those of us lucky enough to be in a liberal democracy might imagine that because we are educated, progressive or compassionate, that we have inoculated ourselves against prejudice. But this play warns us that it is often the respectable and devout citizens, like Antonio, who participate in systems of cruelty without even realizing it. Antonio speaks the language of mercy, but treats Shylock with contempt. He sees himself as morally superior, but refuses to see the Jew as fully human. Shylock's cry for human dignity in the face of prejudice is not a relic of a 400-year-old play. It is still echoing loud and clear in the 21st century. One only has to open a history textbook or a national newspaper to see the devastating impact that misguided beliefs of superiority can have. So isn't that still a danger for us? That we preach love of neighbour, but only so long as that neighbour looks, prays, or votes like we do? When I am asked by students and occasionally adults why we should still read and study Shakespeare 400 years after his death, I always give the same answer, because all of life is in his works. There is no problem or emotion that you will experience that he doesn't explore, sometimes more honestly than we would like. But beyond the extraordinary characters and beautiful poetry, Shakespeare also offers us something deeper. He shows us what it means to be human in all our messy contradictions. In this play, that means confronting how we treat those who are different from us in faith, culture, background, and asking whether we truly recognize their dignity. Shakespeare, like scripture, urges us to look inward first, to examine our own pride, our prejudice, our capacity for mercy or vengeance before judging others. Shakespeare doesn't give us any easy answers, but he does give us the tools to ask better questions through his plots, through his characters. And we can ask these questions about love and hatred, justice and revenge, inclusion and exclusion. We may not be a Danish prince with a stolen throne, nor a wronged Jewish moneylender, nor a lovesick teenager in Verona, but being presented with Shakespeare's rich tapestry forces us to ask the ultimate question that he always poses. Why? Why do we think the way we do? Why do we react the way we do? Why do we say the things we do? Why do we hold certain beliefs and principles? And what value are they when nestled inside a life? This is a skepticism that we should never shy away from, because in the end, Shakespeare shows us not just how to think, but how to feel, and how to wrestle honestly and compassionately with the complex challenge of being alive. Thank you very much. I shall see you on the Q&A.